Fantastic. So, welcome everyone. This is, I think, the penultimate in this year's programme of free training events that has been put on, led by the United Nations Environment Programme, their Global Peatlands initiative, and their research working group, which I co-chair with Diana Kapansky, facilitated very ably by our colleague Jane Gulak from the York Environmental Sustainability Institute, YESI, who can't be with us today, but her colleague is helping out on behalf of her, the Peatland ECR Action Team and CPEAT. So a whole load of peat-focused organisations, and that's where we've targeted the training. But this has been advertised more broadly, and the first 55 minutes of this is designed to work across any context, but I would encourage you all to stay for the two case studies we're going to look at, where we're going to be able to go in much more depth and look at some of the challenges and how we can overcome those challenges in two very different contexts, so one in Canada and one in Indonesia. I will introduce both Sara and Kristyn properly to you in a moment, before their session, and you can see more about them in the original invitation, but more about them in a moment. Let's dive into the first part of the session just now. No, that's not the slide I'm looking for. So switching presentations, here we are. So let's have a think about how we can work more effectively with communities. We're thinking here typically about local communities, but of course, this could be mixed groups of people. It could involve perhaps very powerful players from corporations, from government, etc. So what we're going to be thinking about today will apply across a range of different contexts, but we will think about this in a local context in the two case studies which we'll look at in the second half of today's session. In the chat, I'm going to give you access to a free course handbook. This is my book, the Research Impact Handbook. And I'm going to give you a PDF version of this. So you all have that. We'll be working out of two chapters of the book in this first session. And we'll spend most of our time on chapter 16, looking at the deep dynamics of these kinds of events. And we'll think more briefly about some of the more practical things you can do to design these events so that they effectively self-facilitate. And I think a key approach that I'm going to take to this is going to be about building on your existing emotional intelligence. Because I'm going to suggest that a natural facilitator has two key qualities. They have emotional intelligence and enough confidence to use a few techniques. You do not need to be super confident. You don't need to have lots of experience or even lots of skills or expertise to be an effective facilitator if you have the right tools. And so I'm going to suggest that we can all begin to facilitate more enjoyable, more meaningful, more effective workshops and meetings with local communities and other people with just a few principles in our head and skills and tools that we can all learn very, very quickly. And that's important because these things can go wrong. They can go badly wrong. And you would be entirely rational to be afraid of facilitating these kinds of meetings. And the idea is that these tools will help facilitate really difficult situations. And let's face it, difficult people. So we're going to start with an exercise. And I'm going to share a story about my experience working with a local community in the Peak District National Park. This is a town hall that we are working in. This is me as a PhD student at the time. I was in the last year of my PhD, so an early career researcher, as I know many of you are coming into this call today. And I would like you to listen to this story and try and generalize from this what went wrong and what went right, and why. And from this, I want to generalize a bunch of principles of good facilitation. But my hope is that those principles will be more firmly embedded and memorable based on how you drew them out of the story. But my hope also is that they're obvious, and you discover and realize that actually you have within yourself many of the skills and tools you need already. It's about bringing them to consciousness and starting to use these skills and ideas more purposefully. So here we are. We know that we're going to be working with some communities in the Peak District in the north of England. We want to develop a project which ultimately will lead to what's known as the Peatland Code, a policy and market mechanism that enables companies to invest in peatland restoration. We got there in the end, but it was a very shaky start. We were given some money to run some workshops to try and build a proposal. But the deal was we needed to bring these people with us. So this is high stakes. And so I decided to hire a professional facilitator. And instantly you can see something didn't quite work out based on this picture. But an initial point is to suggest that if this is high stakes, as it was in this case, or high risk, as it also was in this case, I knew these people were in conflict with one another, or if you are not sufficiently independent or trusted to be able to facilitate this, then you may want to pay an independent facilitator. The problem is you need to plan ahead and you need some money. I was trained by 2 people as a facilitator. After this, in fact, this experience was what made me realize I need to get training. And one of these is an internationally leading facilitator. And she will charge £5,000 to £6,000 for a small workshop, up to £10,000 for a larger workshop, just for a one-day workshop. So that's what it will cost for a world-leading facilitator. You can get much more cost-effective facilitators than that. But the point is, most of us don't have the foresight or the money to be able to get a professional. But do always bear that in mind for high stakes, high risk, and situations where you, for some reason, can't do the job. So we hired an independent facilitator, and an important detail, as you'll discover later, is that he was an American who had lived all of his life in Austria, who we flew over to do this work for us. The other precursor to the story that you need to know is that I had handpicked these people. 12 to 15 people, I can't quite remember how many now, but I had gone around, I'd interviewed people, and based on my interviews, I'd chosen, say, my 12 people. However, as I walked into the room and welcomed people, I realized that there were 3 gentlemen I did not recognize. They had gate crashed. Interestingly, they were all older gentlemen, and they were all wearing tweed, which I now know would have told me something had I known as much as I now know about this particular peatland community. I didn't ask who they were or why they were here. The workshop started, and our facilitator opened the workshop with an introduction to himself, which went on much longer than I had expected. And in fact, he had brought a slide deck with him to introduce himself, and he went into some detail about a canal unstraightening project that he had facilitated in Austria. And you could see these people looking at each other, kind of wondering, are we in the right place here? Because I thought this was meant to be about peatlands. And eventually he finished this, and already there was a slightly frosty atmosphere in the room. Now, instantly, there are a number of mistakes that both me and the facilitator have made. What are those mistakes? You can raise a hand or you can write them in the chat. And why are they important mistakes? There's an obvious one, but there's some kind of deeper things we can unpack already, hopefully. So I'll give you some typing time for those who are typing. And Ella, over to you.
I guess I'll start. So I think there's sort of probably a bit of a mistake on both hands. So I think not talking to the facilitator in advance and understanding what they would be presenting, and them not knowing what your agenda was and your timelines. And also I think for them presenting something that had no value to the participants. I think with a workshop, you need to either have value for you or value for the people at the workshop. And it doesn't sound like their background had either. Not to be too harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. So choose someone who actually knows your culture, the issues, if you possibly can. That's often a problem, if we're honest, but it definitely helps. Catherine also agrees, choose your facilitator wisely. I should have checked what he was going to say. There should have been a better briefing of him and of him to me. I should have interrogated who those people were. As Hadi says, know your audience. Yeah, we're starting at the wrong end. We need to know who's in the room, why they are there. And Jenny, yeah, he's making it sound like this is all about him. And actually, this is about him as someone who is very different to everyone else. So here am I, someone from outside your culture, who knows about canals, not peatlands. And actually, I'm kind of puffing myself up and making myself sound really impressive and important. And the whole time, I'm actually kind of setting myself up above you and creating social distance. I'm not doing what we should be doing, which is creating empathic connection. Poppy, over to you.
So I think having the actual facilitator start is a shame, not having you start and actually introduce them, because you're the one who'd made the contact with the audience members initially. But I'm also worried about these three unknown gentlemen dressed in tweed and what's coming with them later.
Yes, absolutely. So important. And fantastic points on the chat as well. Agree with them all. And already, hopefully, you can see, yeah, there's some pretty obvious things here. Just engage my brain and my heart a bit. And I might get a sense of what's going on and already start to avoid or correct some of these mistakes. So let's move on in the story. The conversation starts. Our facilitator stands there with a thoughtful expression on his face, says nothing. It goes on and on, all the way into the break, past the break. And by this time, everyone is actually arguing with each other. People are colouring up. People are not happy with each other. It's the same old debate, argument that's going on round in circles. And the facilitator is doing nothing. And so at this point, I stand up and say, well, I might just be a PhD student, but I definitely know it's break time. Can we just call time on this, please? And at the break, I went to my facilitator to say, why are you not facilitating? You're here to facilitate. And he was like, there's this really major problem, which is I'm an American who's lived all my life in Austria. But all these people are speaking with thick Yorkshire accents, and I can't understand a word anyone is saying. So we have a plan B. We're going to bring everyone back in, and we're going to do a post-it note exercise. So great, we can read what is written on the post-it notes. And we do that, except the three gentlemen don't engage. So I go and explain, so this is what you need to do. Great, do you understand? Yes, fantastic. Everyone has now done it. Everyone's now looking at the three gentlemen. And so I ask them again, so do you know what you're doing? Why haven't you done it? And one of them admits, we are illiterate. We can't read and write. And at that point, I wanted the ground to swallow me up because I just embarrassed these gentlemen in front of their peers. So we finished up the exercise, and then I was like, we'll take a very early and extended lunch break, everyone. While I go to my facilitator and ask, do you have a plan B, which doesn't involve speaking or reading or writing? And of course, the answer is no, which is why I end up being the facilitator. We start after lunch, and I said, look, guys, I'm really sorry about how this went. I've spoken to you before, you know what we're here, why we're here. I want to see answers to these questions and build this project with you, hopefully as much as you guys do. I am just a PhD student. I'm not trained in this stuff. I just want to help. So I started by saying, our facilitator will write. I'll translate Yorkshire to English and just check, are you happy? Is that been written? Great, we'll just stop, pause, fantastic. Now, who wants to go next? And everyone played ball. The arguments stopped, and we got to the end of our workshop with a few useful things. Right at the end, I planned to just stop the workshop, thank everyone, and then go round one by one to apologise and try and persuade these people to forgive me for what I put them through and get them on board to join our project. Our facilitator, though, realised, yeah, you've missed something out, Mark. You're meant to be doing a round robin. And of course, I hadn't communicated that to him. And so he then did the round robin and asked everyone to tell us, A, what they thought of the workshop, and B, whether they were in. And at this point, I was like, oh, he's killed the project. They're all going to say they're out, and there's no coming back from this now, surely. And you can't quite do this without a Yorkshire accent quite so effectively, but they all gave us the most horrendously negative feedback to our face. I've never had such a painful round of feedback in all my career. Basically, never do this to us ever again. It was hideous. But with the exception of the three gentlemen, which is a clue to the question that is coming to you, everyone said, I'm in. Now, everyone finished, we went home. There was a few people still standing around chatting before they went. And I went up to these people and I was like, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our project. But I really didn't expect that. Why did you say yes? And so the question to you is, well, why do you think they said yes? And what did I do right? It wasn't a lot to at least finish the workshop without everyone at each other's throats, having done something that was useful enough. So what was going on there? Thoughts and perspectives. Right, so Catherine, I'm being open. Freya, I'm being honest, it didn't work. And Jen also, that honesty. And there's something that's going on. Why is that honesty so effective? Yeah, you can be painfully honest, you can overshare. I probably do that on a regular basis. Ultimately, nobody's got what I'm looking for here. Okay, so they felt sorry for me. And what's going on here is there's empathic connection. So we've all been in situations like this. It's not my fault, but this is not going my way. They're sitting there and they're putting themselves in my shoes thinking, what a nightmare for poor Mark. But that is possible because I've already built a relationship with them. I've built some trust in those interviews going in. They kind of know me. They know my heart. I've made clear this is my heart, but this is not going my way. And that honesty now creates an empathic connection. It's not your best one. Ideally, not wanting to make people feel sorry for you. That's not the best way to create empathic. But in that situation, that was how I was going to do it. And I think this has real value compared to me saying, right, I'm now taking over as facilitator, and we're going to do this properly now. And this is now all of my credentials and why you can trust me to do a better job. And now let's start. Yeah, that's a very different way of taking over. And that vulnerability, I would argue, is part of what creates that humanity, that common humanity that enables that empathic connection. And so that connection, that seeing of hearts in terms of ultimately what do we want to achieve, and the fact that, yeah, we all have that same passion to see these peatland environments working for us and being restored. Yeah, ultimately, this is what wins the day very often. And I'm going to suggest we all have that in bucket loads. And as peatland researchers, as I think the majority of us are, that passion, channeling that passion at that deep level very often is what then creates empathic connection. And that can be with people who are diametrically opposed to us in a debate. I did some research with the peatland community elsewhere in the north of England, where we got people to do value orientation questionnaires. So what ultimately are your deepest held values? And now let's ask you a bunch of questions about peat bogs. And it turns out when it really comes down to it, we share the same values. We want to protect this environment. We want to hand this down in better condition to future generations. And we may differ about how we do that, but ultimately we have the same core values. Now, when we talk at that level, we are the same, despite the fact that we might have differing opinions. Great, Benjamin, you got what I was looking for there. So there are some deep things that we're doing here, and my suggestion is that we all have what it takes to become a really effective facilitator if ultimately the two key qualities we're looking for is emotional intelligence and enough confidence to use a few tools. Now, the first set of tools I'm going to give you, again, are in this category of emotional intelligence tools, but we're going to start getting a bit more practical now, because I'm going to suggest that the number one reasons workshops and meetings go wrong is simply power, and specifically power discrepancies and dynamics that have been left to go wrong. And so I want to now get you to make explicit a bunch of implicit tools that you use without even thinking when you walk into a room and make a bunch of judgments. But I want to get you to make this explicit, because very often the judgments you make when you look at a person and what they're wearing, for example, may in fact be wrong. And so by making this explicit, I can also spot prejudices. So, for example, I walk into a room and there's an older gentleman wearing a suit and tie. I instantly go and shake hands with this person because they must be powerful. Oops. What trap have I just fallen into? Okay, great. So let's override that and now look more deeply. And we're going to look at a number of different variables, and we're going to triangulate them. So social science would suggest this is a way of bringing rigor to what we're doing, so that I'm not going to fall foul of making assumptions which are incorrect. So let's build this up and come up with a few different things that we can look at that are now together are going to very reliably tell me who is most powerful and least powerful, and to what extent is there a power imbalance in my group, so I can start managing it. And I'm going to suggest, if this is the one thing that is most likely to go wrong, then this is your one job as a facilitator. If you're going to make this a safe space in which we can do our best thinking together, your key job is to manage the power dynamics. So these skills are key. So here is your challenge now. Next exercise, a scenario. A colleague has asked you to stand in for them at the last minute. So you have not had time to research any of these people. And of course, good practice, I find out who these people are in advance. I do my homework, but you don't have time to do this. Once things have got to the point where people are colouring up and pointing at people and the like, which is where I intervened in that workshop, it's probably too late to bring things back in most cases, unless you're a skilled facilitator, or in my case, I got a bit lucky, but it was just using my emotional intelligence skills as it happened. I'm going to ask you a much harder question before anyone has even opened their mouth. How do you identify the power dynamics? And the answer is not body language, but there's a category of answers that are body language, so go deeper than just body language. Body language, other things as well. How do I know there's someone in that room who is more powerful than everyone else, and someone in the room who is less powerful? Whether that's their own opinion of themselves, the group's opinion of them, whether it's real or not real. How do you work out what's going on in terms of a power discrepancy? Someone powerful, someone not powerful. Again, answers in the chat. Let's see what you've got here. As we build this up, we've got a whole load of variables we can now start to look for on purpose, triangulate between, and very reliably now get a sense of, okay, here's someone powerful. Okay, here's someone I'm going to have to make sure I empower to bring into this effectively. Right, so when people do start talking, who speaks first? Who has that confidence? And that kind of chitter-chatter, people have started around the table. Who has the confidence to be the first to break the ice if it's a small group, for example? Interesting. So where people stand or sit in the room, who suddenly goes to sit next to them, who now is congregated around them. In fact, there's people satelliting around, waiting their turn. And who is the person sitting with no friends, looking at their cup of coffee, trying to not look at anyone? Great, that tells me something, perhaps. In some cultures, in a British culture, for example, if it's a board table, then who gravitates to the head of the table. Who actually now takes their chair and draws it back to the wall. And says that there's 2 layers of seats now, and I'm a second-class citizen. And in fact, yeah, I'm just observing. Don't talk to me. I don't want to be engaged with. Great. So yeah, let's go for the ones that, so before talking. So yeah, lots of great answers when we are talking. Who doesn't let anyone interrupt them, just raises their voice. Who gets most airtime, for example, unfacilitated. It's your task to make sure that there is equal airtime if you're doing open discussion. Right, eye contact. Thank you, Camilla. And this is an interesting one. So I'm going to suggest when people are talking, who do they give eye contact to? Who do they pass over as though they're not really important? And as a facilitator, you should get a good share of that. And if you're not, then there's a problem in terms of your facilitation. So you can check, do you have the group or not, by looking at this. But in particular, look not only at who gets the highest proportion of eye contact when people are talking, as one indication, but also who gets eye contact when people start talking and when people finish talking. So if there's one really important person in the room, when I start talking, I want to make sure they're listening. You're not looking at your phone, you've got my attention, fantastic. I'll maybe give a couple of other important people some eye contact. The person taking minutes never gets any eye contact. They actually feel like they're invisible. Back to the important person, you're still with me, great. And now I'm going to finish my point and give eye contact to the important person, effectively inviting them to respond and give me what I want. Right, great. So loads of things, and you'll see much more in the book. All of these things are great. Loads of body language ideas people have got. Let's summarize that as confident and open equals power. Unconfident and closed equals less power. And the assumption is, yeah, I don't know why they are so open and taking up space. Man-spreading, as we sometimes describe it, because men tend to do this more than women, but it's not just men who can do this. They believe they have the right to be able to do this. I wonder what's going on there. So you're asking those questions. And maybe, yeah, that person is looking out the window because they're bored. Maybe it's because they're offended. Maybe it's because they're disengaged. Maybe it's because they can't understand the language. You need to try and work out what is going on with that eye contact. Sorry, with all of those non-verbal cues. But put together now, I avoid falling into prejudicial assumptions. Hopefully, I've made that explicit. And now I can start to manage the power dynamics. And that's where I want to conclude with a whole load of tools. So I'm going to open up a toolkit for you now, and I'm going to invite you to look at these tools and ask yourself how these tools do your one job. Remember, your one job being to manage the power dynamics. And the first tip I'm going to suggest to you is not to fall into the trap that most researchers fall into, which is to use most professional facilitators' most feared technique. This is the technique that we use when we have the most experience, expertise, confidence, and even then we use this with fear and trepidation, and yet it is the #1 go-to technique for researchers around the world. And it is, you've guessed it, open discussion. And it's because we think it works. We do it with our research colleagues and it works all the time. Well, if it does work, it's probably because there isn't actually a power imbalance in that group. And then I actually think about it, and what proportion of airtime do the PhD students in our research group actually get compared to the professors? Maybe in reality, it doesn't work as well as I think it does. So yes, we're going to use some open discussion, but we're going to bound it very carefully and do a bunch of things to hopefully make it safe. But I don't just dive straight into open discussion. If someone is going to grandstand, misbehave, if things are going to go wrong, that's where it is hardest to manage. So let's have a look at some other ideas. And the great thing about this is that even if I'm quaking in my boots and really struggling with confidence, and I'll confess to you, I've spoken about this openly, I struggle with anxiety. I get panic attacks. I will blank out in front of large groups of people, and I do not sleep before facilitating a workshop with a challenging group. I get very, very nervous. So I sound confident. Great, sitting in my own office talking to a computer, I can look very confident. But if you, like me, suffer from anxiety, or just this is a very rational reason for being afraid, then these skills, these tools will manage the power for you, even if this is a very powerful, badly behaved person and a really challenging situation. So I'm going to open my toolkit up in an order. I'm going to share some opening up tools, which you might typically use at the beginning to get lots of ideas out. We're going to move to analyzing tools to pick through those ideas, think more critically about them, and then we might need to close down and make a decision at the end. So we'll give you some tools for that, because it can all be going swimmingly well until that point, and then it all descends into chaos right at the last minute when we need to actually decide on one way forward. So in the chat, again, I'm going to invite you to suggest what's going on here. Hopefully, in most cases, this will be fairly obvious, and we'll make room for some questions at the end. So, no, that was not the slide I was looking for. No slides for this. So, first of all, let's try something called meta plan. So I'm going to give everyone, say, 3 post-it notes each. And I'm going to put some flip chart paper up on the wall, and I'm going to invite everyone to tell me what is the answer to this question. So what is the one topic we're going to focus on, or a project we're going to fund, or whatever it might be. If I have people who are illiterate in the group, I'm going to make sure I've got scribes for them to work with, or I might just also have a segment where I let people talk to their ideas, whether they're on the board or not, so that I've made this as inclusive as possible, bearing in mind what went wrong for me that day. If I'm doing this online, then I might use a tool like Google Jamboard, and I'll share what that looks like just now. Don't worry about all the numbers, but you can see that I have now invited everyone to take their post-it notes and bring them to the front of the room, or put them on the Google Jamboard, and to cluster similar ideas together. In this case, we've got more than will fit onto one board, so let's move someone to a second board. I'm circling these similar ideas and giving them an idea. So representations of peatlands in this particular example is one of the groups of ideas that we've got. Valuing the ideas that only have one, they're just maybe very innovative ideas, and great. So we've now got everyone to put their ideas out, and this, for a small group, is 5 minutes. For a large group, 50 people, 10 minutes. Everyone's ideas are out. Compare that to how long it would take in open discussion for even 5 people to have their say. And you may get dominated by one person. This is very different. But specifically, I told you I wanted you to look for how this managed the power dynamics. Can anyone spot how this technique, without me having to say anything, managed the power for me? Yes, I will make sure via Eventbrite I send my slides. And Jane, I'm going to be quoting you later on. Thank you. Great comment. So every post-it is equal. Everyone had their say, and everyone got the same number of post-it notes, Poppy. Thank you. The verbose person that would have dominated my open discussion only had 3 ideas they could put down. The quiet person who might not have said anything in an open discussion also got their 3 ideas. So we want to move into analysing now. Let's do a carousel. So we're going to have 4 groups, and we're going to give everyone an amount of time, and then we'll rotate the groups. We'll start with a large amount of time in the first group, go to the one that you're most interested in. Great. We talk about that one first for lots of time, and a smaller amount of time, even smaller. And then finally, we're going to cut the boring presenting back, and we're going to just get everyone to go back past the group they started at and see what was added. If I give every group their own coloured pen to move with as they go, I can instantly see what was added. And great, now in a segment of as little as half an hour, ideally longer than that if you can, we've given everyone time to dive into these in a bit more depth. But let's think about the power, because I've chosen 4 groups, but how did I choose those 4 groups when perhaps there was a dozen ideas up there? And this is an opportunity for a power play. So now we're going to give everyone 10 sticky dots, and everyone gets the same number of dots. It's the same way to manage the power. This has happened to me twice now, academics in both cases. If someone asks you for more dots because they know more than everyone else, then the answer is no. Everyone gets 10 sticky dots. And in this case, I've given everyone 5 coloured post-it notes so they can keep track of them. And now I can count them up. Ah, great, these are the 4 we're going to go with. In this case, we've got 5, but there are 2 that are quite similar. We'll combine these. Now we're going to take these post-it notes, and that is going to be the basis for the discussion group. Let's dive into these, think about these ideas, discuss them in much more depth. Fantastic. The second way we're going to manage the power dynamics, though, is that we're going to choose who's in which group. So I've got 2 people hitting off each other. Instantly, we're going to do some small group work next, and we're going to number everyone 1, 2, you're separate. Fantastic. We're having some discussion, and it's clear that only the managers, the important people, are talking. So if you are in a management position, I'm going to ask you to go into one room, or on Zoom, I'm going to just create some random groups really quickly and tell everyone, if you're a manager, if you are senior, stay in the main room. We'll do some special stuff with you. In reality, I just want them out of the room for everyone else so people can speak their mind. But whatever the categorization is, whoever has got power, if you can spot them surreptitiously, you're trying to get them out of the small groups so people can actually talk without those people dominating or manipulating the situation. And now you deal with them. And even if you don't manage to deal with them very effectively, at least you got them out of the rest of the rooms, the rest of the group. Now you can do this in advance. Everyone's got to stick a coloured dot on their badge, or I've got pre-assigned Zoom rooms now for the discussion. And we're having the conservationists and the farmers in separate rooms, so you don't conflict. Or maybe I want some creative tension. You get to choose how you manage that. I know there's someone problematic. I'm going to make sure they're in my group. And it's a smaller group. In one case, I designed an entire workshop for a shepherdess. It was a different peatland community, but she was known to be disruptive, so much so no facilitator had ever managed her, because her technique, if you tried to shut her down, was to simply stand on her chair and shout. And so even if you have someone like that and it doesn't work, this is now a quarter of your group that have had a challenging experience with, in this case, my shepherdess. But at least 3/4 of the group had, hopefully, a good time. I can choose whether I want each group to have their own facilitator or not, as the case may be. This is something which is much easier to deal with. And if I do want a facilitator per group, then I'm going to choose a team member. And again, it's those 2 things. Who in my team is quite confident and has got good emotional intelligence? You're going to be group facilitator. Online, instead of the post-it notes, instead of the flip chart paper, I have a Google Doc per group. When you join your new group, I just take everyone back into the main room. Great, choose a new group, or here's your next group, and I put them into the next room. You get into the next room, they've got their new Google Doc link, and again, you can change the color. We're now writing in a new color at the bottom, and when everyone comes back, here are all the links. You can look at them all and see where you are in your own time or over a break. We avoided the boring report back again, and hopefully had some small, safe, productive discussion, but it's been bounded. There's a clear time limit. I'll quite often have a break coming up after that. So if there have been any issues, I can sort them out after the break. Nobody wants to be late to a break, so we finish on time. Great. It's there, but it's very bounded and hopefully safe. Finally, we're moving to closing down techniques, and we need to make a decision, and this is where things can go wrong. So who shouts loudest, who has most power, who says, yeah, I'm paying for this, therefore, if this is a funding decision, I choose, whatever it may be. And I actually had that with a funder once, a slight challenge. So We could simply do another sticky dot prioritization. We've discussed these 4 ideas in some depth now. Which of them do we like best? Put your dots. But very often people say it's just not that simple. We need to discuss this. So let's discuss the complexity. What are the different criteria against which we might make this decision? Well, one of these might save lives. One of them might save the environment. Well, which one do we care most about? Well, you tell me which one you like best and why. Now, on each of these bits of flip chart paper, I've got 2 boxes: save lives, saves the environment. I might use a Google Sheet to do this online. And now I'm going to tell you, I like this idea, but because it saves lives. This idea because it saves the environment. And now I can see, great, we've got 2 ideas which seem to have more votes than anyone else. Maybe they're quite close in the number of votes with these sticky dots. But now I can see why, based on these criteria, and we can facilitate that discussion and make a transparent decision. And the evidence suggests people come in polarized, they may come out just as polarized. This is not about consensus. Consensus building techniques often reach dysfunctional consensus because, you know what, I can't be bothered fighting. I'll let the powerful people dominate. Instead, we move forward, accepting we have differences, but this was a fair, transparent process, and therefore I live with it. People don't keep coming back and trying to undermine, delegitimize, revisit. Yeah, it was fair. I didn't agree with it, but I live with it, and we move together with difference. Now, I'm going to conclude with a couple of, I'm going to give you one, actually, much more in the book. In fact, here we are. Here's the pages in the book. But a way of avoiding a car crash. My biggest nightmare, especially with academics, is people who talk too much. I can't talk because here I am droning on, but it's a huge problem. And the technique I love most for dealing with this is something I call any other business. So we've got someone who's droning on. It's the 3rd time they've mentioned this point, and you can see the body language is not good. People have started turning their cameras off. It's pretty clear this person is answering their emails now. People are looking out the window, whatever it may be. I need to do something about this person. We are not going to stay on track. I'm not going to be able to give everyone else their say. And so I'm now saying to this person, great, I hear your point. If they've got a big ego, I might massage it. It's really an important point. Fantastic. Thank you for making it so well. However, we do need to make sure that everyone has a say. And so we're not going to revisit this anymore. I'm going to ask other people to speak, but I want to make sure this is captured. So I want you to write this point onto a post-it note. And at the end, we're going to make time for any other business. As you read in my book, I always make room to, we'll cut something out here. We'll do something a bit shorter over here. There's always flexibility in a facilitation plan. And now, at the end, I've made 10 minutes for any other business, maybe even 20 minutes for a longer workshop. Everyone understands that. Yeah, great. We've got any other business at the end. That is going to be on the board, Google Jamboard, or in physical on a flip chart. And I also say to everyone else, if there's a point you wanted to make that you didn't manage to make, I want you to write it up. Every break, I remind people, we've got this, we will come back to this later. And at the end, my verbose person has been kept in check. Great. You can't talk anymore now, but you can write it on the on the board. And I made room for others during that discussion time. I also actually gave power to the quiet people who might never have spoken in any of those, even small group settings, but who were happy to write something on a post-it note. And at the end, I don't say who wrote this, I just read through them, and everyone's voice is heard. And for that time, limited, because we need to go home, we do get a bit more discussion on those points. So many other ideas in the book, but my hope is to stimulate you to go and read and explore, and crucially try these ideas out for yourself, because ultimately this is about having enough courage to use the tools. Try it with your research team. If you teach, try it with your students, get a bit used to these. My hope is that these are things that are familiar. You've used them before even perhaps, but you can see now the deeper dynamics of how they actually enable you to manage power. And so effectively, to quote Jane from earlier on in the chat, thank you for that, the issue is that it could still be a bit scary. So the courage you need is simply to try these things out. And this is in particular when the most powerful person in the room realizes what you're about to do and slaps you down. In my experience, it can be patronizing, it can be intimidating, and it's because they have subconsciously or consciously realized that your technique is going to prevent them from dominating, and they're not happy about that. And for me, it was that insight that gave me the courage to say, you know what, I'm pushing back on this. We don't have to do this, but we're going to try it out and let's see if it works. It is because they are so powerful that I am feeling intimidated by them. And that's why we need courage, because remember, courage is doing the right thing despite being scared. So go out, try these techniques yourself. The message is you can do that one thing. You can manage power, even as the least powerful person in that room, if you use these techniques. But I would encourage you to dive into the book, in particular box 12, a bunch of techniques that are the work of months and years, I would argue, that can give you an inner confidence to enable you to do incredible things as a facilitator. And this is that I've been working on 4 years as a person who struggles with anxiety, that enables me to do many of the things that I do despite that challenge. So over to discussion time, and we have a bit of time for discussion. So in the chat or on mic, we won't get to them all, and perhaps Sara and Kristyn can answer some of them in their segments as well, because there's more time for discussion later. But putting them in the chat, it could be a tip, a tool, an online tool perhaps that you use for facilitating online. We've been talking about that. Maybe it's an action you're going away to do, inspire others with your actions, or maybe it's a challenge. Over to you. I'll give you some typing time if you're writing in the chat. But you can raise a hand at any point as well. And Ella, over to you.
Can you tell I hate silence? So I just wanted to, it's probably really familiar to everybody here, but about the kind of managing power dynamics. I had something very similar in workshops in the Middle East. Obviously there you have a very defined hierarchy, particularly gender difference. And we actually use Mentimeter very effectively for getting over that kind of power dynamic. Particularly, we had different member states that were cagey about disclosing some information on climate change issues. And it worked very well because you could see what was popping up on the screen, but it's anonymized and it's recorded. So it was a very neat way of capturing all of that stuff. So good also to know that that is sort of going along the right lines as well.
Right, well, the key principle here is anonymity, which is why I recommend using voting. Everyone put up your hand. Huh, I'm not sure I want to actually vote for that. You also get groupthink in terms of, am I going to be the only person who votes for this option? Yeah, so anonymity is the key thing that works with Mentimeter. Great suggestion, thank you. Julia, thanks. I think another thing that helps with power dynamics is to set ground rules and ensure everyone follows them. I was thinking about sharing 2 ground rules, and I looked at 2 car crash techniques. I looked at the clock and decided against it. This is my other one that I use all the time, especially if you're going into a really high conflict situation. And I don't talk about the conflict. I talk about, we want to do creative thinking. We want to create a safe space. We want to be productive. Well, here are some of the rules that have been tried and tested. And I used Nancy Klein's listening environment for this. Actually, Ella, if you could put a link to Mentimeter in case anyone's not familiar with this. So look up Nancy Klein and her listening environment for some examples of ground rules. And yeah, nobody's going to argue with these. In fact, this is great. This is about deep listening. That's what we want to do today. But it includes that we're not going to use offensive language, for example. We're not going to interrupt each other, etc., etc. Now, I check, does everyone agree or not? Do we want to subtract or add anything to this list? And this is crucial because what I have now is a social contract. And now when someone starts to misbehave, I now invoke that social contract. It's not just me. This could be my line manager who would say, well, you have no right to shut me down, Mark. Actually, we agreed that we wouldn't interrupt and we wouldn't use language which could be considered offensive. Just in case you're not aware, this word can be considered as offensive. And so I'm just going to remind us, you and us all, of those ground rules we agreed at the beginning. And the peer pressure of that is enough that most people will comply. And if necessary, I can now ask you to leave the room or eject you, even easier on Zoom, based on these ground rules. And it's never got to that point for me because the peer pressure is so strong. Great. Freya, does anyone know any equivalent to Google Jamboard? And I'm going to give you a link to my blog with a colleague, Salsa and Curie. We reviewed all of the different tools. Google Jamboard is probably the least functional of them, but it's probably the easiest to use and the easiest to access, which is why I use it. But here is a fairly systematic review of everything that is around at the moment in terms of making workshops more interactive in the chat. Mural is a great example. Thanks, Ella. How important is it to remember names? When I'm doing face-to-face, I use a technique. Every time someone says their name, I make a story up about that person. And it pretty much works for about 80% of the names, and the magic of, wow, you remembered my name. In terms of giving you a really deep form of power and respect that enables you to facilitate. Yeah, it is almost magical how it works. It's great. So yeah, I do try and do that when I'm doing face-to-face, but of course you don't need to do that online. In terms of references, another way of doing that, especially for a group that works longer term. Poppy, I think this is probably our last question or comment now. Says, I wasn't facilitating per se, rather running in a session where people could ask questions to address what is often an agenda imbalance is asking questions. The first question to the speaker had to be asked by a woman, and it set a tone of men not dominating from the outset. Wow, I love that. I mean, it would be more challenging in certain cultures than others, I suspect. But I think that's a really nice alternative that I think would probably work in most UK cultures. I would hope would work in UK cultures. To the example in the Middle East. That's great. Fantastic. So keep the ideas coming. That's us at 5:02. So I want to move now into case study mode. And I think that it's all very well thinking about these ideas generically, but I think it's really important to put some flesh to the bones. I gave you a story to start with. We're going to hear two very different sets of stories from Indonesia and from Canada now. And I encourage you to stay, to think critically, and there's going to be room for questions and debate after each of these. And some of those questions may in fact be about applying what we've just learned in this last session. How would that work? How did you deal with that in your particular context? So this is going to be really useful to embed, but also go deeper and further than we've done before. And we're going to go, let's check the order right, with Kristyn first. So Kristyn, it's a real pleasure to get to meet you, and I've obviously heard about your work for a number of years, so great to get a chance to engage more. Kristyn is a wetland stewardship specialist with Ducks Unlimited Canada and their national Boreal program. She's an ecologist with an earth sciences master's from McMaster University. She's got over 10 years of experience in consulting, academia, and non-profit roles, bringing diverse groups together to discuss and facilitate wetland conservation, including, of course, peatlands under those in that water, under that water even, and sustainable land use and restoration. Kristyn, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for setting the scene for this. And I'm going to try and be as savvy as you are with switching between my PowerPoint and Zoom, but we'll see. You did a great job of that. Oh.
So if you just go into slideshow mode.
Yeah. There we go. How does that look?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's morning where I am. But yes, I'm with Ducks Unlimited Canada's National Boreal Program. I'm a wetland stewardship specialist here. And today I'm going to talk about our program's efforts to engage with both industry and different community representatives across Canada's Western Boreal Forest. We often bring these groups together to talk about wetlands, their classification, their abundance, and ways that we can collectively conserve or more sustainably manage these ecosystems. And I'm often going to interchange the word wetland and peatlands today. Being from Ducks Unlimited, we're really interested in a lot of that open water habitat, or what we call splash habitat for the ducks, but we also care deeply about all wetland types. Peatlands included, bogs and fens are extremely abundant across Canada's boreal. Before I get too much deeper, I just wanted to pause to take a minute to respectfully acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and Edmonton is located on Treaty 6 territory. This is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit, as well as many others. At Ducks, we respect the histories, languages, and cultures that continue to influence and enrich our community. And I would encourage you all to let me know where you're tuning in from as well in the chat box. I will keep going for now, though, and maybe take a pause in a few minutes to take a look. So as our name implies, Ducks Unlimited Canada conserves, restores, and manages wetlands and their associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. But we recognize that these habitats provide immeasurable benefits to our environment and society. And we are Canada's largest wetland conservation organization. As part of our National Boreal Program, my work in particular focuses on the 85% of Canada's wetlands that are within the boreal forest. So it is estimated that over 120 million hectares of peatlands exist across Canada's boreal. And this is an area larger in size than the entire province of Ontario. My team here employ a science-based, partnership-driven, and solutions-oriented approach to conservation in this diverse landscape. I realize that this audience does not need an introduction to peatlands or an overview of their importance globally for water and carbon conservation, but I just wanted to really briefly highlight here how intrinsically connected these ecosystems are to Northern Canadians' ways of life. They hold many values for Indigenous communities in particular, including what I've heard termed as grocery stores or medicine cabinets. In other words, they are integral to supporting subsistence-based lifestyles. They're also an integral part of our working forest. So our boreal forest supports a lot of resource extraction industries, and these represent a vital part of our economy, as well as supporting the livelihoods of many people in Northern communities. So at Ducks, we work tirelessly to communicate the functions of boreal wetlands and promote better recognition, best management practices, and research within these environments to help guide some of the activities occurring on the land. Within the conservation programs team, we have three main strategies for working towards conservation in the boreal forest, and we hone in on aspects of outreach, building relationships, and knowledge mobilization. And my case study today will exemplify these through the remainder of the presentation. Our overarching goal in our program is to collaborate with industry and communities across the boreal forest who have considerable knowledge of wetlands, including peatlands, and have the most influence or impact on how these environments are managed. Our bottom-up approach to engagement with these groups aims to ultimately influence more sustainable land use practices, understanding that by creating partnerships, collaborating, and ideally co-creating resources or practices will yield the best outcomes for the peatlands. So inviting interest groups to attend a workshop on wetlands is a futile exercise if you do not first establish a relationship with them. So my first guiding principle that I wanted to present today is all about building meaningful relationships. You want to attempt to really understand the needs, perspectives, and constraints that any interest group you're working with is faced with. why should they prioritize a conservation discussion about wetlands over any other concerns that might be directly affecting their livelihoods or their interests? And I realize this is not an easy task. Often when we're trying to source grant funding to support a new project, we have trouble meaningfully engaging with communities until the funding is in place to help guide this process. And by then, it's too late for us to change course on any of the deliverables or the timelines that we've committed to as part of the grants. So it's the ultimate horse before the cart situation for us. And I suspect that many of you here have also experienced this. We can talk about this more in the discussion. But yes, ultimately, I do not have all the answers to dealing with these situations, but my team has realized success in aligning our conservation goals with our industry and community partners to diversify our funding sources. And the particular example that I would like to present is the Forest Management and Wetland Stewardship Initiative. So this partnership came to fruition due to a collective understanding of the opportunities and constraints that working in and around boreal wetland environments poses to the forest industry across Western Canada. Within our Boreal program, we're able to offer expertise and collaborate with the partners on solutions. And we have produced several resources as a result of this partnership that are now actually formally referenced in forest management regulations in Alberta, Canada. So I would say this partnership is undoubtedly my team's proudest collaborative project to date. It's made up of 7 different forest management companies and associations from across Canada, shown here. And we are collectively working towards shared goals to advance sustainable forest management, as well as communicating and implementing best management practices for wetland and waterfowl conservation. I mentioned we've created a lot of resources as a group. These are the first 3 that we produced, and the QR code here will take you to a website where you could download them if you're more interested in what they look like. Starting from the left, the first guide contains a decision-making approach for mitigating the risk of accidental harvesting of waterfowl when doing forest harvest. The guiding principles book in the middle contains planning considerations for how forest managers can avoid or minimize adverse effects to wetlands. And the best management practices guide on the right contains planning and operating practices for wetland road crossings, timber harvest, and forest renewal. Based on the success of this collaboration and the strong relationships that we formed with our partners, we initiated another 3-year term with 3 fresh projects for the Forest Management Wetland Stewardship Initiative in 2020. And today I'm going to speak to number 2 listed here, where we made significant steps in operationalizing the previous resources I mentioned by building further relationships with forest company staff and spending time together in the field in the summer of 2022. So this brings me to my second guiding principle for hosting workshops with communities or industry. Whenever possible, meet with the community or industry representatives on the land, ideally with rubber boots, bug jackets, and sunscreen. So for communities across Canada's boreal forest, wetlands are places they experience every day in their livelihoods, for recreation, possibly for subsistence, or as part of their jobs. So the typical person that I'm talking to about wetlands probably spends more time in these environments than even I do. So we have so much more potential to exchange valuable knowledge and perspectives about these ecosystems if we visit them together. As one elder described it to me, we should experience the wetlands, we should listen to the birds, and even embrace the mosquitoes. These are places that you experience with all of your senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And I think that if you invest the time and energy in meeting the needs of your interest group, scheduling a field visit according to their location and their availability, and if you consider accessibility in your choices, you'll have so much more success in actually meaningfully engaging them about the issue you would like to address. You should also think about contingency plans, bad weather, bad road conditions, or you should work with your partners to learn as much as possible ahead of time about the lay of the land and the best sites that might be accessible for you to visit with them. If you're working with industry, you might have an example to go and learn more about their practices. You could see how they're constructing a road crossing or how they're harvesting an area, and that would only help inform your perspective and your understanding of their side of the equation. The one thing that you definitely have to do is make sure that you appropriately budget for these needs and constraints when you're putting in any funding applications. I know that my team has not been great at this in the past, and we're really actively working on trying to make sure that our budgets are robust enough to accommodate more engagement in the field with that necessary travel to our partners to go and see their work on the ground and have these discussions with them in the actual peatlands. And this is what we did all last summer. So coming out of the COVID pandemic in particular, we were on year 5 of the Forest Management Wetland Stewardship Partnership, and we were dying to get outside. So over the summer of 2022, my team conducted 7 separate field tours with each of our partners across the province of Alberta. We were in the field for 15 days total. We visited over 42 individual sites representing intact wetlands, road crossings, harvest blocks, and other sites of interest identified by our partners. In total, almost 150 people participated in these events, and we think they really helped us operationalize some of the resources that I described earlier. So getting them into the hands of the people who we really wanted to see using them. We've similarly had success conducting these kinds of on-the-land workshops with other diverse groups, including the public, wetland professionals, researchers, staff, or in one case with an Indigenous Guardians program in Northern Alberta. So this event with the Guardians happened in 2019. And it was just such a meaningful experience for me in particular, because we went into it thinking that we were going to do sort of a wetland classification training event, but I came out of it learning more than I ever thought I would about some of the medicinal plant species within the wetlands in particular. So the 2 pictures I'm showing here, one is wild mint and the other is rat root. And these are 2 species of importance for the communities, and they actually showed us how to harvest them and leave a tobacco offering to thank the creator after we did the harvesting. So this was an experience that I did not expect to happen going into this workshop. And I am so glad it did. It was extremely enriching for me personally. Okay, so my 3rd guiding principle is to make sure that everyone is speaking the same language. When you approach a new partner and tell them that you want to work on an important peatland research or conservation issue, do they even understand what a peatland is? Or is their understanding the same as yours? So do you even understand what a peatland is from their perspective? And this is something that I have come to face a lot more as I try and broaden my vocabulary about peatlands. And in particular, I have come to embrace the term muskeg. In Canada, this term is ubiquitous in everyone's vocabulary. It's the term that Canadians use to describe peatlands. And so I personally think we really do need to embrace it and use terms like that more often when we're engaging with the public. And I'm curious, I'll take a break here to hear what other terms you've heard peatlands referred to as. So if you'd like to use the chat, would you just mind throwing in some of these colloquial or slang terms for peatlands? I want to see if there's anything in particular that maybe I haven't heard you can surprise me with. And this is where Mark's skills at sharing screens outwit mine. Let me see if I can open the chat here. Here we go. Yeah, so the classics, bog, fen, mire, lowland areas, we hear that a lot. Mosslands, that's a great one. Veen, I've never heard that term before. Katie, I feel like MAMBA is an acronym that maybe you could spell out for me. Maybe it's an inside joke. I've never heard the term level either. That's a new one for me. Okay. Okay, I will keep going, but we can come back to that later if you have some more fun terms for peatlands. So really briefly, how do we make sure that everybody we're engaging with is speaking the same language? Well, we have a resource for that. Where I live in the province of Alberta, we created a field guide for wetlands. So the idea was to connect the wetland policy to the public, try and explain very visually what these ecosystems look like, and make sure that when we're engaging, we have a tool we can actually provide people with to help them understand how to identify and then classify wetlands. I won't go through this in detail, but just show a couple of the ways that we really tried to jam as many visual cues as possible into this field guide in particular, just to hopefully help people really connect more with some of the Western science perspectives, but also maybe just understand that when they're out looking at these plant species, these are indicators of peatlands in particular. Okay, so the hire a facilitator recommendation, I was really keen with Mark's introduction story on how I might frame this guiding principle. And I think what I really wanted to drive home here was that there is definitely a role for a professional facilitator in some settings, and especially if that person is able to bridge a gap to the community that you were trying to connect with. And the example that I have for this is we recently worked with an Indigenous elder who we hired as a facilitator for a 3-day workshop that we held in the Yukon Territory of Canada. And the reason that this elder was such an asset to the workshop is because he had a network that he was able to engage and bring to the workshop of other Indigenous elders from across the territory. And he also has a model that he employs for respectfully engaging with Indigenous communities in particular. It's called the Land and Peoples Relationship Model. And if you're interested in that, I can put a link in the chat afterwards to his website. So he brought a considerable network. He brought lived experience, insights into the histories, the culture, the languages, and the experiences of each of the communities who were participants in this particular workshop. And overall, he was just a professional. So his expertise was really invaluable to making the workshop a success. The last recommendation I put here that I thought was something new or maybe novel that I'm seeing more and more is hiring a graphic recorder to facilitate or document the outcomes of your workshop. So instead of writing, a 10-page summary report, maybe you can get an illustrator to illustrate some of those outcomes in a more engaging way for you. Okay, and then the very last guiding principle that I want to cover, establish metrics of success. And I realize that this might bring about some PTSD for those who frequently write grant applications. But what I really want to convey here is less about what does the funder think is a success for your project versus what success do you want to see for your organization. So it's less about metrics and more about relationships and improved practices in or around peatlands. So ultimately, my team is focusing more and more on co-creating resources with our partners, understanding that this is the most likely way to affect real change in practices in or around peatland environments. We measure our success based on the strength of our relationships, and we tend to see more opportunities present themselves to us when we have stronger relationships with our partners. We also strive to keep an open mind on the ultimate outcome of our collaborative projects. Might be less about the resource we create and more about understanding the perspectives of the people we're engaging with and co-creating a resource with those perspectives at the forefront. So we do have a few more examples here of resources that we've created, but I will highlight that these are sort of where we've been in the past. Obviously, things like wetland crossings, we've worked closely with industry to develop some of these guides. But in the future, I'm really hoping that my team will be able to showcase a few more resources where we've worked more closely with Indigenous communities on co-creation and bringing or weaving both a Western science and a traditional knowledge perspective in some of our work. One last embedded case study in my presentation of case studies. So my team has recently taken over a hands-on demonstration site within the Western Boreal Forest in Canada. And the express purpose of this site is to hold in-person workshops talking about peatlands and then development in and around peatlands and best management practices that can be used in these environments. So we actually have a physical location where we're hoping to do this more. And we're really excited about it. So hence I had to include it. Last summer alone, we had over 2,000 visitors at our wetland center. A lot of them are school-age children, but also a lot of industry and community folks who just come out and see what we're up to. This project is also a multi-partner collaboration. It has an advisory group, and they help provide direction at the site. It is definitely not just Ducks Unlimited leading the forefront here. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much for letting me present these case studies today.
Fantastic, Kristyn, fascinating. And yeah, just as I was hoping, that real lived sense of what actually works in reality, or not, as the case may be. Lots of comments, a couple of questions in the chat. I'll leave you to just have a quick look through them as I'm wrapping up here, Kristyn. One from me was, I love that idea of meeting on the land. I managed to get the UK's main funder, now called UK Research and Innovation, to actually pay for pub lunches and beer on a project once to do with peatlands, on the basis that we all needed to go to the site and have our workshops outside. And we'd all then we would start with a pub lunch, which was a great way of building connections. Again, very culturally specific. It would not work in many other cultures. But the nightmare we had was rain. And I mean, yeah, in Canada, you do bad weather, much worse than we do if it gets bad. What do you do when the weather descends and you're trying to record stuff? Sorry, you're on mute. I muted everyone earlier when I came out.
Sorry, no worries. I was going to say, I think we got really lucky last summer. We did 15 field days, and I don't think that we got rained out for any of them, to my recollection. But always have a backup. So we always had sort of, like that classroom option available, right? Ideally, we're on the land. And then if we can't, so I mentioned we held a workshop a few weeks ago with some Indigenous elders. In that case, I brought a lot of visual cues. So in particular, to talk about medicinal plants, I brought large printed pictures of those plants. So bringing the field to the classroom, if you can.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I guess also, if you can't get out into the field, it's another kind of an alternative to doing that. Yeah, if only we just stayed in the pub. That would have been a great idea, had I only thought of that. Great. So does anyone want to raise a hand and ask a question before I look through? Did you have a chance to choose a question you'd like to answer?
I'm seeing a lot of reinforcement for graphic recorders, which is great. And then I see Katie's clarification about Mamba miles or miles of Boreal. I think I have heard that actually. So yeah, sometimes peatlands are referred to using expletives, which is just a perspective that people who have kind of suffered with this boggy ground come with, and I'm open to hearing it. You know, it's and then maybe sort of introducing tidbits of knowledge that might change that perspective. I don't see any specific questions though.
No, thank you for all the great comments. Jemima just saying pubs have worked in Somerset as well. And the challenge is you might propose, let's stay inside because you want to record what's going on, and your farmers are like to say, weather? Go on, it may not go down well with a bunch of farmers to be a fine weather walker.
Yeah.
Going anyway. So here's a question from Jen. How do you try to get a representative group at workshops?
Yeah, so by appealing to their interests. So I think we're starting to slowly understand for the main groups that we work with, either the forest industry or often Indigenous communities. I think we're starting to have a better understanding of what their perspectives are that will pique their interest about a workshop that we might be hosting. So we can offer more efficient and more cost-effective practices that they can employ in their operations. So I think that really helps in some cases working with the forest industry. And for communities, like I think that our conservation goals are just often naturally aligned with theirs. And so it's an easier sell, although often they do have a lot of competing interests. Where can they focus their time and their capacity? So we need to make sure we sell it well.
Yeah, very good. I've got another suggestion in the chat. And oh, great. So thanks, Jenny. We tend to run sessions outside in the morning and then bring people back inside for lunch to warm up or dry out. Great. And that's all. Yeah, we've got that to look forward to. Emma, it looked like you use a lot of information sheets. Do you think that the usage and benefits they bring justify the expense? So one last question, if that's okay, Kristyn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think overall that, yes, they do justify the expense. You need to be able to, again, pique your audience's interest. And then that usually is through flyers or brief information snippets that reel them in, especially if they're engaging and highly visual. So I think that is worth the effort early on to increase engagement.
Yeah, brilliant. Although the point about language also applies, and literacy, etc. But yeah, great. So thank you, Kristyn. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm now looking forward very much to learning with Sara from your experiences in a very different environment. I'm working in Indonesian peatlands this time. So Sara is Principal Research Officer for the Ecosystem Health and Social Dimensions team at the Wildlife and Wetlands Trust in the UK. She is an interdisciplinary conservation researcher with an interest in socio-ecological systems, interdisciplinary approaches to conservation, debates surrounding sustainable development, and the role of different knowledges in conservation research and management. She's got 10 years of research experience in tropical peatland ecology, livelihoods, and conservation. Her PhD, which I'm sure we'll be hearing a bit about, explored peat swamp fish and the importance of fish and fishing to human communities in central Kalimantan in Indonesia. So over to you, Sara. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, let me share my screen, try and get that up. Let's see, here we go. Can you all see that? All right.
Not in slideshow mode yet.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Has it gone into slideshow now?
No.
Oh.
Which is rather strange because I saw you press the button.
I did. Let me try something else. I tend to have issues when I'm trying to figure out. Let's
slideshow first before you share screen. That might solve it.
Oh yeah, let's try that. Okay. Oh, interesting. Or no, let's not do that.
It's an interesting comment in the chat while Sarah's working this out from Rapesh. Thank you. And Jemima just saying it so depends, doesn't it? So I think a key message across the board is we need to adapt to our audience and to our context. And in fact, a great way to put people off may in fact to say, yeah, you're going to get really wet and muddy and dirty. Or potentially lead to a bias. I think that you were saying that certain people will come, others will avoid. Yeah. So
has that
no
come up properly?
Slideshow mode. But do you want to just maybe kind of zoom in as far as we can to that slide to minimize the? We can still read it. We can still read it.
Apologies, everyone. I'm not entirely sure why that's not working for me. I'm wondering. Is that all right, Mark, or?
Good enough, yeah. Unless anyone else has any bright ideas, I'm not a whiz at all. I gave Sarah my only one idea. So, well, let's just go with it.
Okay, sorry about that. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining today. As introduced, I'll be discussing my experiences of using workshops and predominantly, in this case, focus groups working with fishers in Indonesia. So I'll briefly explain how I went about designing my focus groups, why I chose certain approaches, and through this, I'll also explain what worked for me and the various aspects which I considered closely for my focus group designs, in particular things like group size, setting, how I use the focus groups in combination with other research methods. So I'm going to take a very practical approach in this presentation. And then I'll also finish up with briefly introducing what research approach that I'm now exploring in my work, as of course this journey of learning and training and workshop facilitation continues. And so for this final part, I'll briefly talk about participatory video and aspects that are particularly relevant to also workshop design. So,
Sarah,
yeah.
would it be okay? Oh, you're just about to do it to explain the difference between workshops and focus groups. I
yes.
do apologize.
Is that what you want? We're going to prompt, Mark?
Exactly. Great. Thank you. Carry on.
Yeah, so this actually came up from a discussion which Mark and I had about whether focus groups are a type of workshop or not. And so just before we delve into focus groups, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to explain what to me sets focus groups apart from other types of workshops. And also to flag that some people would see focus groups as a type of workshop, while others would actually argue that they're quite different to one another. So to me, I actually see that they are different for several different reasons. Some of these can include that, for example, focus groups tend to be more focused in terms of, the topics or the questions that you're dealing with. They tend to target also a certain group of people to get their views, so they're more homogenous in the participants. While of course, as we've heard that, with workshops more, generally they include wider participation of different types of participants or stakeholders, and so they tend to try to bring together a wide range of perspectives. And then focus groups tend to be on the smaller group size. So you tend to see them including, maybe 4 to at most 10 people. And this also means that the results that you're getting from your focus groups, they're not meant to be generalizable, to the wider population. While workshops, you do find that these tend to be larger in size. You can have, more than 20 plus participants in some cases. Then focus groups also tend to not be so much about obtaining a conclusion, but rather, ideas to work on or different strategies to move forward. And, workshops, you tend to try to, reach some sort of conclusion or decision on actions. So you try to, close it up a little bit more tightly. And then, yeah, focus groups tend to also last shorter in duration. So they tend to be maybe 1 to 2 hours long. And workshops, as many of you probably know, they can be 4 hours up to several days long. So importantly, the facilitation techniques and the design tips, which I have for, focus groups, do overlap with those that I have for workshops as well. So for my PhD and postdoctoral work, I was working mainly in the peatlands in central Kalimantan in Indonesia and Borneo. For my PhD, I used focus groups primarily to inform the design of my in-depth interviews. So this was also a very specific use of focus groups, which I'll go, into more detail later on. And for my postdoctoral work, I did, support a number of workshops exploring peatland ecosystem services. But today I'll be focusing mainly on my PhD work. But I'm also, of course, happy to answer questions on the other workshop experiences that I have as well. So for my PhD work, I used a combination of focus groups, in-depth, semi-structured interviews, as well as questionnaires in 2 villages with very contrasting environments. One was located in a predominantly intact peat swamp forest, and the other was in an area of really highly degraded peatland that experiences regular fires and flooding. In both of these locations, I was looking at people's perceptions of environmental change over time, their perceptions of what the future of fish and fishing looked like in the area, their experiences of fish population and diversity changes in recent years, and the reasons behind these changes. And I looked at the importance of fishing for lives and income, how participants learned to fish, various fishing methods which they used. And lastly, I was exploring conflicts around the use of fire, the use of different fishing methods, including those that are considered harmful for the ecosystem, as well as tensions around conservation approaches in these peatland landscapes, such as the building of dams. And I also combined this social science research with the ecological surveys of peat swamp fish to explore the wider peatland social ecological assemblage and human non-human relationships that form these ecosystems. And if you'd like more detail on this work, you can find my thesis online as well. So importantly, there's no one-size-fits-all for designing focus groups. The specific approach that you take really depends, of course, on the purpose of the focus group and the type of information that you're trying to find out. So I used focus groups primarily, as I said before, to generate ideas and to get an idea of the variety of opinions and issues that were relevant to consider when discussing fish and fishing in this peatland area, which then informed more specific and more relevant in-depth interview questions. So for me, the focus groups provided the breadth of information, within the in-depth interviews providing the depth of information. And I found this approach really helpful, but again, the way that you might design or use focus groups can look very different to this. And often starting out with conducting workshops or focus groups for the first time can feel really daunting, as Mark has also touched on. And if you're relatively new to these approaches, or even not, having a really good support team is, I find, crucial. In particular, I found this also to be the case when you're, of course, also working in cross-cultural settings. So for me, my research team takes a really active role in research design. We designed the approach together, the questions together, the activities together, And this helps to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But it also helps to share the ownership of the process. And so allows my team to also ask important questions, particularly if they felt that, something was missing or misunderstood. This also ensured that they felt able to ask follow-up questions where needed, because importantly, several members of my team were also community members of one of the villages. So of course, they may have a much better understanding of certain nuances in the discussion than I would have. And having my whole team very active in this process also created a helpful dynamic between us all, where we were all on this journey of learning along with our focus group participants. And of course, it was also another step to ensure that the questions and the approach that I was taking were appropriate to the culture, the context, and as effective ultimately as possible. And lastly, of course, having a great support team also makes the process less daunting. And to me, I also find it more fun. So you've got your workshops or your focus group design, and then at some point you have to start thinking of, where do I find my participants? And for this, we also had a very specific approach that was decided again in conversation with my research team. We decided to use on-site recruitment, usually led by Chris, who was one of my facilitators. And this was done because people would likely feel more comfortable declining participation if he was the one recruiting rather than if I was the one recruiting. As again, Chris was a member of one of the teams. He was one of the villages. And so he had that long-term rapport already built. And Chris had sometimes already recruited people, the day before, or he recruited participants on the same day, depending on which location we were, because one of the villages was quite remote. But in any case where I was present during this, participant recruitment, then he would approach them with me waiting out of earshot. This again was done to allow people to decline participation without facing me, and therefore this was, considered less confrontational and more culturally appropriate. And throughout my work in Indonesia, we usually use verbal consent and that's preferred over, information sheets and written consent forms, as these are often seen as more formal, potentially more intimidating to participants, with also, some potentially losing face if they have literacy difficulties. Important with that, when you're, depending on verbal consent, is of course ensuring that, your team and your facilitators are trained and they know exactly, they know all the important aspects of informed consent, which they need to cover. So then the other thing to consider is, of course, setting and location. We took a very informal approach to this to really, set the scene, get people relaxed. So our locations were always chosen by participants at the time when we were about to hold the focus groups. And this again, it just enforced that, this was an informal atmosphere. It also allowed people to choose their own locations. So you're giving some of that control to the participants themselves. And to me, I also felt that it really enforced that message that I'm a guest in their space. And so we ended up using a variety of different locations. We used a community patrol office. We used, a public area by the river, and also numerous times we were in front of participants' houses as well. And so another question which, you'll come across is, okay, well, how many people do I need to include? Also, should I be mixing genders and issues around that? And with these focus groups, I decided to have different groups between men and women. And this was mainly because I was interested to see if I could spot any clearly contrasting viewpoints between them. I also decided to keep group numbers low. This helped, managing some of those kind of power difficulties, which Mark was also touching on, where you might have one person really dominating the conversation, and I find that you tend to not, it's easier to manage when the group numbers are lower than when they're higher in many cases. And this was also because of potential language barriers. So while I had conversational Indonesian language skills, in this area they speak multiple different languages, and so I also wanted to work with an interpreter who could speak all the languages, so that participants could choose whichever language they felt most comfortable with. So in the end, we ended up having 2 focus groups, one with men, one with women in each of the locations, with numbers ranging from 3 to 5 people. And even though workshops tend to often be thought as being more active or participatory in some ways, I guess, with activities, I find that activities are helpful also in focus groups. And I also sometimes use activities to start off interviews as well. I find that they're very helpful when, again, potentially dealing with language barriers. And I also feel they help, getting people into that creative space of brainstorming and trying to put ideas down and just starting that, starting with that dynamic. So we used various brainstorming, listing, and ranking exercises. This was often done, if we were using writing, this was often the facilitators that were writing down things rather than participants, to again consider those literacy issues. We also invited people to draw instead of using words. So that's also a great way around sometimes, just depending on words as well. And yeah, so we, used various exercises. Here you see the ranking exercises, which we used in after the brainstorming happened. And then here at the bottom, that was another brainstorming activity where we were exploring, for example, participants' perceptions of, the value of the river, or the, various uses of the river, etc. So then the focus groups, the results from the focus groups were actually used to design the in-depth interviews. This was, the interviews then, were used to further clarify people's perceptions and values related to the fishing and their experiences of environmental change. The interviews themselves also then allowed participants to tell and express, their own personal experiences and stories to a much greater extent. And this ended up being, the main focus of my thesis. But the focus group discussions were absolutely necessary to ensure that my interview questions were effective and were relevant. In this way, importantly, I was also tackling that assumption that, that I knew all the important questions to ask. And it also allowed the results of, the focus groups to really guide the scope of the interviews. And this approach was really important too, in also trying to challenge my own external views and potential biases as a foreign researcher. And so to kind of come to the end, I also wanted to briefly touch upon my trajectory following this work in Indonesia. And I've often still struggled with this feeling that, the research approaches that, from workshops to focus groups and interviews, they often still provide limited tangible benefits to participants in the longer term. And so I've started exploring other, participatory techniques to address some of these imbalances that I've been feeling. And in this journey, I've come across participatory video. And while I haven't conducted participatory video training yet, I have completed extensive training in participatory video facilitation, and wanted to just flag this approach up to you all today as well, because I think it will be increasingly used in environmental research settings. So I trained with Insight Share. They have a whole lot of open access materials on their website, including information on activities and games, which I'll touch upon here, which are also really useful for other, workshops that you may hold. So yeah, participatory video, it's a set of techniques to involve basically a group or a community in shaping and creating their own film. And the idea behind this is, that making a video is easy and accessible and is a great way of bringing people together to explore issues, to voice their concerns, and to tell stories. And in a research setting, participatory video can be used to explore topics like people's relationships to wetlands, their experiences of resource conflicts, or even their experiences of climate change, for example. And the key here, which interests me, is that, of course, while you can use the process of participatory video, creation as a research method, so you can, for example, conduct focus group discussions during the screening of the final film, for example, participants are also learning skills around using filming equipment, planning and editing their own films. And so once your research project is finished, participants can then use these skills to advocate for other things that are important for them and their community once the researchers leave. And so with this approach, you can build skill sharing and capacity building into your research as well. So participatory video with Insight Share, the approach which they teach, it's really developed to support participation by anyone, regardless of literacy level, physical ability, or age or background. It really incorporates other techniques such as nonviolent communication and design thinking, and it's really about hands-on learning where mistakes are encouraged and you're learning through simple games and exercises. And I found these really inspiring to use in also other types of workshops in the future. This included, some of the very well-known PLA techniques. These are participatory learning in action. It's a type of qualitative research which also allows participants to share experiences and knowledge with each other. And you will have likely come across some of these techniques in other workshop settings, like the problem tree, which, here on the top left, that's a tool for working with groups to identify the root causes and impacts of particular problems. Or the river of life, for example, which is a great tool to explore changes over time, things like the history of a community, or, to also plot key events that have shaped people's experiences, for example. And then, of course, also community mapping, which is how, people view and relate to their surroundings. And so personally, I love taking different courses and trainings on workshop facilitation and participatory techniques, because everyone always has their bag of little tricks and tips and activities which they find particularly useful, which are often applicable to a wide variety of workshops or focus groups or other research approaches that you may take. So for those of you who have already some experience of workshops or focus groups, and you're willing to share, let us know what your favorite activities or games are. I've set up this little Mentimeter poll, so you all have an opportunity now to log in. You can submit your answer. Then once you're done, select go to the next question and send me the results. If you enter your email, the results will be sent to you. And feel free, if you don't have any experience yet, feel free to put not sure yet or something similar. You can still have access to other people's tips. So just to end, there's of course a huge variety of ways which you can use workshops for your research and for your project. Workshop facilitation is a skill in itself. It takes time and practice, and of course, there's going to be, mistakes which you learn from along the way, and that's part of the learning process for it. So I would highly recommend that you do trial runs of activities when possible, just as you do, trials of interview questions as well. And I would urge you all to, think creatively about the activities and the ways that you can get the group actively engaged and also build trust with each other. So this can include energizers and different games as well. And lastly, of course, I've found that the learning and the training on workshop facilitation and techniques never stops, and that's also a great thing. So if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes now to touch on them. But if you also want to get in touch, my email is up there. I'm also on Twitter. And yeah, I'll actually copy this in case someone needs more time and put it in the chat. But for now, I'll stop sharing. Let's see.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. So if you can put a link to the Mentimeter poll and that number that people can put in,
Yes.
and then maybe as a final point, if you want to have a look and maybe share a screen to the ideas that have come in so far. So let's have a look. Do we have any questions in here already? First of all, just I loved this actually. Before we get to the questions. Fascinating to hear your perspectives. The richness of the different techniques has certainly got me inspired. Remembering techniques I've heard about, but also new ones. We could all be so much more creative. And it's not just about getting better data, that's just making it more fun and engaging. And of course, your point about your support team and it being fun, it's just so important to do that. Thoughts, reflections, questions. Poppy is saying it's really interesting about having your own views as a facilitator, and one from overseas, from a different culture at that. If you want to expand on that or react to that, that build on your comment.
Let me see. Sorry, can you repeat
So it's not really
that?
a question, actually. It's Poppy, who was just riffing on that theme of
Oh yeah.
what if I do have very different views, and especially from a different culture, and what do I do with that?
I think yeah, that's I mean the cultural, that cross-cultural work is always quite a challenge. I think personally, so it helped that I'd been working in that area for quite a long period of time, even before my PhD. But that's also an aspect of learning the language. At least some of it is really helpful, because of course that gives you certain insights that you don't have, in all honesty, if you don't have some understanding of the language. I think again, having as many conversations and just building that trust and that communication with your facilitator team is key in that part as well, to build those cross-cultural bridges and understandings, and also just coming at the whole project with this approach that I'm a student, I'm learning, I do not know, I'm definitely not an expert on anything, in this space, and just taking that I guess humble approach to that process, yeah, was key as well. But yeah, that cross-cultural dynamics are always quite challenging. But I think yeah, it's also something which always excites me. There's always so much learning that you can have in those spaces too.
Yeah, I wonder if I can ask, is there any other questions? A final question for you then, Sara. Elliot's brilliant. So I'll give Elliot the final question. Over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. My question was very, very practical. I was wondering, when you were arranging the focus groups, particularly on the day, and you had multiple participants, how did you get them all to congregate in the same place when you were asking people, where do you want to have this? What did you do when two different people said, oh, we'd like it in this place? yeah, how did you find people turned up on time and or
Yeah.
not?
So the approach which we took as well, like time was very flexible. You know, we had the whole day open for, you know, that kind of 1 to 2 hour long focus group. So it was very much, it was a, you know, big time commitment. It's very flexible in terms of, you know, the different participants and their own schedules. So it was literally a process of, you know, going around seeing if people would be willing to meet us, you know, somewhere in the town. And then often, you know, we'd congregate the focus group, you know, the participants together, and then we'd have a conversation where they would prefer holding it. So it was a very informal, very, how would you say, like, yeah, ad hoc approach to it. But it also, yeah, I felt that then the dynamic of the discussions were also very relaxed and very informal, which is what we were hoping for.
Great. We are pretty much out of time, so I'm just going to wrap things up. And for anyone who has time, it would be great, Sara, if you could screen share in a moment with the findings from your Mentimeter poll.
Yeah.
But just to make sure that we don't forget, it would be great to get your feedback on what you thought of today. You can find out all about what we've been doing at the Research Working Group online, including this and all our previous sessions. That's not the right Twitter handle, so I'll move on swiftly from this. All our previous sessions are on YouTube, and our next session is learning from experience doing peatland research in developing countries. So I think it's a nice follow-on, especially from the stuff that Sara has just been talking about today. So the link to book onto that is also in the chat. Sara, do you want to just conclude with a screen share of what people submitted to the Mentimeter?
Let's bring that up.
Can I speak to Chanel, please?
Yay, fantastic. A Margolis wheel. I have never heard of that. There's something to, if whoever wrote that, if you can give us a link, otherwise there's something to Google. Great. And energizers like Ninja. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we could spend so much longer. Amazing. So much great ideas. Thank you everyone for all of your great suggestions, all the stories you've shared, and for the questions you've asked. It's been a real pleasure working with you all. Thank you especially to Sara and to Kristyn, for Jane in her absence, for all the help that she's done to organise this, and for her colleague who's very kindly stepped in today. We appreciate your help very much. Thank you, Rachel, as well. So take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening or day, as it happens in Kristyn's case, and we'll see you at the next training.